section. And I think it's a really important issue to deal with and do further research on. How can we reform rental laws, as Parekh does point out in his paper. The second issue, I think, is the whole question of homelessness and sort of related street sleeping, which is a growing problem in cities in the south, but also increasingly in the west. In the UK, there was a survey done of homeless populations in London, and it showed that the homeless population that was street sleeping was growing. And so this is an issue that cuts across, I think, all growing cities. In India, I believe that the census count of 2001 estimated about 1.94 million homeless people, and a local count in Delhi estimated about 150,000. And there's some debate about whether these numbers are sort of underestimating the number of homeless people. What policies can we think of that would help this highly excluded group of people access at least some housing? And if not some housing, at least some of those benefits that housing conveys, such as identity cards that enable them to access, say, subsidized rations, health services, etc. So thinking a little bit more about these issues would be good. I believe that Delhi, there's a move towards providing identity cards to street sleepers, for example. Why is this important? This is important because, as Holston and Appadurai identify, they identify cities as the location for the determination of substantive citizenship, as membership in nation states is neither necessary nor sufficient to convey citizenship. So particularly in states, in countries where the state has an incomplete control of its territory, not necessarily the case in India, but many states in Africa actually don't have control over, or even in Latin America, don't have effective control of territory or an incomplete presence and penetration on the ground. So, even though notionally the state is in control, in reality there is no state in many places. Cities thus become the places where citizenship is negotiated. And it follows that access to housing, because it conveys identity, is a means of realizing one's rights. And this is why I think inclusion is going to be important. These issues of citizenship, negotiating citizenship, demanding accountability are taken up in the very good chapter by Samuel Paul on generating demand for good governance. The paper starts with the now sort of accepted premise that electoral democracy has not, by and large, worked for the poor, not just in India, in countries all over the world. As he argues, quotation, from a citizen's perspective, these failures amount to a breach of contract between state and its citizens with disastrous consequences. And this is akin to the failure of the fiscal social contract that Paul was talking about, that you pay your taxes and you get services in return, but if you don't get services, you're unlikely to comply with tax policy. Some have called this sort of acceptance, in a recent book by Akhil Gupta called Red Tape, he mentions this is almost a form of structural violence when you deny people sort of these sorts of rights. But clearly, it's got serious implications both for marginalized citizens, obviously, because they suffer the consequences, but also, as I argue, for the public at large. This is not a question of inclusion because you want to sort of be charitable, but also because it has larger public good benefits. What Samuel Paul does in his chapter is gives examples, and like he said, it's not necessarily urban examples, of various ways that citizens in India, it's a survey of the experience in a sense, various ways that citizens have used to bring their voice, and particularly, of course, discontent, to those in authority. So there are several tools in this new repertoire of citizen action, and it's often labeled as social accountability in the literature. For example, community scorecards, social audits, which started with the MKSS work in Rajasthan, as many of you already know. Citizen report cards, which were, of course, part of his own organization in Bangalore, initiated public expenditure tracking surveys, which actually haven't been utilized thus far in India, as he points out, but have been quite popular in Africa to try and expose corruption and try and sort of stimulate sort of response from the government to try and improve service delivery. And these public expenditure tracking surveys, the most famous example, of course, is from Uganda, where a survey was done on education expenditures to local schools, initially at the beginning and at the end. And in between, there was an information campaign that communicated to various communities what expenditures or what finances they could expect their schools to have received, and publicized this. And at the end of this period, they found that actually the schools, after the information campaign, almost got over 80% of the expenditures were received, whereas prior to this information campaign, the schools were receiving only up to 18%. So the sort of improvement was huge in this public expenditure tracking surveys. He also points out other sources of accountability mechanisms, such as public interest litigation and citizen movements, including things like the Right to Information campaign or the India Against Corruption campaign. What's interesting about the chapter is that he points out that varied tools are appropriate for different purposes. You can't use every tool in every situation. It's all context specific. So, for example, citizen report cards, while they're expensive, are more rigorous and can sort of trigger all kinds of accountability that's comparative, whereas things like social audits or citizen community scorecards have a more limited impact on communities around particular services, not across a board of services. He also suggests that some initiatives might be used sequentially. So you try social audits, and if they don't work, then you go in for public interest litigation. These tools of social accountability are being used throughout the world, and the experience with them has been quite varied. He talks a little bit in his chapter about impact, which suggests that there are signs of sort of positive impact on these issues. However, surveys of the worldwide literature suggest it's not as simple as that. And we need more research in understanding what tools to use under what conditions. Now, these tools also follow a global trend in attempting to strengthen a direct accountability relationship between citizens and the state. And the sort of report that triggered all of this was the World Development Report of 2004, Making States Deliver for the Poor. And basically what the World Development Report did was to identify two routes of accountability: the long route, which was through elections, and the short route, which was through direct mechanisms or connections between citizens/users with providers and policymakers. While the chapter itself talks mainly about accountability in sort of making demands on the state, I think what's missing a little bit, and was pointed out by somebody in the audience in the beginning, in the earlier morning session, was this whole issue of participation in decision-making around urban issues, which is sort of lacking in perhaps as much as possible. As we've heard in earlier sessions, there are various reasons for why this hasn't happened. As pointed out by several people across the book and also in earlier sessions, responsibilities and resources have not been adequately dissolved to urban local bodies. So even if they did want to include people and respond to their needs, there hasn't necessarily been an ability to do so. There's also been an unwillingness to progress towards municipal autonomy. And the governance structures in urban local bodies are often fragmented between different state-level agencies and also within a multiplicity of urban local bodies. So as somebody pointed out in the morning, it's very difficult to know who to make demands to if there's a multiplicity of institutions and organizations. Moreover, it's also clear that elected representatives at the local level, where there are such elected representatives, they aren't present everywhere. In many places, it's not clear what their mandates and responsibilities actually are. And in fact, they work sort of towards more in terms of patronage politics rather than getting responsiveness to the most marginalized groups. Now, all this sort of poor picture of electoral representation as the means to getting responsiveness could be balanced in terms of direct citizen participation in planning. And thus, inclusion can mean inclusion of all voices in planning processes. And obviously, sort of trying to include everybody in planning processes at the urban level, even if you sort of subdivide it into suburban processes or sort of lower level processes, it poses its own challenges. These processes have been tried in places. In particular, Brazil has been sort of at the forefront of some of these initiatives. Everyone in this room must have heard of participatory budgeting, which started in Porto Alegre in Brazil, which, although it doesn't sort of mean exactly what it says, it's not participatory budgeting for the whole budget, it's only for the capital expenditure side of the budget. And some experience suggests that it's worked in some places. And I'm afraid that although it's a messy process, it seems to work in places where there's strong political support. And in Porto Alegre, of course, it was the left left party that was in this thing. It's been tried in many, many other cities in Brazil, and the overall evidence seems to suggest that politics matters. No surprise there. In addition, in the sectoral angles, in Brazil again, governance councils have also been tried. And these are councils where at the local level, you have councils for health, for social assistance, etc., sectoral councils, in which these are platforms, institutionalized platforms that are mandated, where you have representatives of the government, local civil society organizations, representatives of membership organizations, political parties, etc. They all come together to make decisions about policy that are relevant to the local area. And again, these have been relatively successful in some areas and not in others. In particular, the health councils have been quite strong in getting these participatory processes going and making sure there's social inclusion. However, of course, I mean, even these processes of these governance councils acting, getting together to make local policy is problematic from the point because it raises questions of representation. Who are the people who get access to these councils, even if they are platforms for representation? Okay. In India, of course, in Delhi, we have had the Bhagidari scheme, which was sort of an attempt slightly to do the same thing. However, it seems to be largely, from my reading of it, oriented to the middle classes rather than the urban slums and the poorest of the poor for various reasons. And some scholars have argued that this kind of sort of segregation of these participatory institutions to certain segments of society can create two tracks of politics. For the middle classes, for example, you have this participatory process like Bhagidari working, and for the poorest, they're back to patronage politics through the political parties and politicians, local politicians. And this can lead to further exclusion. So I think it's important to keep this in point. The second point about these sorts of processes that require citizens to take action is that it's important to remember that expecting marginalized groups to bear the burden of direct citizen action seems problematic. If you're thinking about the poorest of the poor who are to be included, to impose this burden of participation in all these kinds of councils, in budgeting, etc., is quite an imposition. And in fact, the experience from various countries suggests that even if you do things like provide information to communities and expect that they will make demands for accountability from their local government bodies, they don't always do so. I'll give you a quick example from Tanzania. Organization called Haki Alimu, which is an organization that works with civil society action around health and education, provided information about education, the poor performance of education of children to communities, poor communities, in expectation, and also gave them a little primer on what they should do in order to demand accountability from their local bodies, and expected that they would do so. And this was, in economists' terms, RCT, a randomized control trial, the gold standard of evidence on what works. And unfortunately, they found that actually it had no impact. There was no impact of these interventions on making demands for accountability. Neither was there any impact, obviously, on the test scores, etc.